Welcome to Writer Syndrome, a podcast about writing from start to finish. This episode's topic, men writing female characters. I'm Russ Capasso, and joining me as always is Tim Letney. Tim, how are you? And how does that topic make you feel?
It's a sticky one. I'm a little nervous.
I am too.
Excited to talk about it.
Yeah, I am too. I think it's interesting because when we first kind of brought up this as a topic to cover, I was like, yeah, that kind of scares the shit out of me. But then I realized, yeah, one of my characters in my book is become a more prominent character is a female character. And my second book I'll be hopefully working on next year is the main protagonist is a female character. So fun to tackle those things that scare the shit out of you, I guess. But
yeah, I had the same question when I started writing. I was like, oh, okay, this lead's obviously female. That's who I want to go on this character journey. And then I talked to my wife, this kind of crisis of conscience. Should I do this? Is this okay? Is this the absolute wrong time for me as like a white dude to write about a woman? And she was like, well, just don't be an asshole.
I think that's literally all it comes down to. Like, we're so worried about it. It's like, yeah, well, just don't be an asshole.
Yeah.
Which is good, life motto. Yeah, I think, approaching it with I don't think care is the right word, but just approaching it like you approach any other character. I don't know.
Yeah, I think.
And talking to people, and saying, how would this character interact in a situation that's not maybe your gender or.
I agree. I mean, for me, it came down to treating the character like a person, like making sure everything was equitable between all the characters, that I was treating descriptions and thoughts. And even though like it's interesting playing inside the mind of a female character, I don't think it came across, I hope. I mean, obviously, I'm going to have to rely a little bit on beta readers to see how it lands and how I did. But luckily, some of my beta readers were really female, and hopefully they'll be able to give me some tips or feedback about how I can adjust and fix if need fixing.
Yeah.
But I didn't want it to I didn't want my hesitation or fear to, honestly, what I feel like would derail the story. I had always pictured a female lead in this role. And in a way, like it was confronting a fear by pressing forward. And honestly, as time has gone on, as I've gotten more in the character's head over like the year, it's gotten way, way easier to write as her. Yeah. In the beginning, it was much easier to write as the male characters, so much so that those chapters ended up being longer. They had more like introspection. Yeah. Whereas my female lead had more like descriptive text, but less internal monologue or internal thoughts. So that's changing now on like this third draft, which is wonderful.
My first draft, and I don't think this is on purpose. I think it was just kind of a natural thing I did, was like pretty much every character in my book was just men. And I don't think it wasn't a subconscious, it wasn't like a purposeful thing. I think this was just the characters I had to start. And I just was kind of getting everything into place, and I did have a female character in there, and, she had a small part to begin early on. And after I did the second draft, I was like, okay, I need to change some things here. Like this isn't the world. And then I had a, close friend read the first draft, and he was just like, yeah, you have no, like, it's just a bunch of bearded white guys in your book. I was like, yeah, I know. I'm working on that. I'm like, it's my first time here. I don't know how to approach this correctly. So
I think I had the opposite issue. Like the way that my story ended up developing, and we can talk about pantsing versus planning maybe next episode, but all my characters ended up being different than me in a way. Yeah. Like obviously the lead's a female, the second lead is a gay male, and I'm a straight male. Yeah. And then another side character is an African-American boy. And it's what the story needed, I think. But with each of those choices came hesitation. But I think veering away from it and being less confident about it, or experimental, I guess, would have hindered the story. I mean, I'm dealing with like 1977 Boston, race, the busing crisis. It's a huge issue. I mean, disco's coming up. There's a ton of like homophobia going on. And I thought it would be a kind of cowardice to not talk about it, because it seemed so there. Like it was in between all the lines. Yeah. And by just making lily white characters, which obviously have their own sets of issues and struggles too, but during that time period, it felt like really kind of necessary for me to tell these stories. And granted, it's a horror story and it's got its own tropes, but I think it's better for it by having a more like diverse character profile.
Kind of going on with that, and we kind of talked about this before we started, but we're writing in two very different genres. You're writing in horror, and I'm writing in kind of like the thriller, a little bit of sci-fi, but the thriller kind of landscape. Do you think that has any effect on? Obviously, the horror genre has an interesting run with female characters.
Yeah, horror is really. I mean,
on my side, on my side, the thriller side, like they're not really all that existent. And I mean, they're starting to become. There's like definitely stories out there now with female leads being the assassins and doing whatever. But yeah, from your perspective, like,
I mean, I can't say that I've read every piece of horror. I have seen almost. Now I won't say every horror movie, but I've seen many horror movies.
Pretty close.
And I think, within the past decade, horror is improving. It's telling better stories. I think there's more female writers and female directors that are coming up. That are just releasing like just such killer movies. So there's more comps, I think, on the movie side of things, at least that I could find, than on the novel side of things. So obviously I read King, because I'm looking for comps. I want to see what else is in the genre. So you read the classics like King and Kuntz. And then I've been reading a lot of contemporary horror as well. And some of it's like really good, but I don't want to like speak ill of it, but I wasn't pleased with how they handled female characters. And some had female leads, but those female leads often had their bodies described in ways that was kind of like they were objectified, right?
Yep.
Like, I don't know how many new and interesting ways do you have to describe breasts? Like, is that is that crucial to the story, or are you giving something to the audience? And that's a question that I have with horror, right? Like, horror often talks about, these kind of taboo things. Like gore is very taboo. And I think very early on, like in film, there's always this kind of TNA aspect to it as well. The audience maybe skews younger. It's teenagers. It's, people going in to a movie theater on a date or something. So there's this fear and sexual tension, and it all kind of works together. But that's not what I want to write within. So, and I think that translates directly to King's books. I mean, King will have some passages that just make you feel completely uncomfortable, right? It's like, it almost feels like romance novels for people who don't read romance novels. Like, I think back to my parents reading like King on the beach when I was a kid, and I was like, had I only known the smut they were reading only for those sections. King is absolutely wonderful. I think he's a great writer, but those sections where he's describing women or sex scenes, it feels very cringy to me and feels very base. And it's not. I would love to be able to be as talented as King is about describing towns and characters and arcs and creating fantasy worlds. But when it comes to how he, in the past, kind of used women as these kind of objects of pleasure for the reader, it's not an area that I want to dig into at all. That's not my piece. And then I had that question, like, if I don't have a romance or any kind of physicality in the middle of my story, is that something an editor is going to kick back in and be like, hey, we really want these two characters to have a relationship, and that's not my story, unfortunately.
I have the same concern. Actually, I was just gonna one of the things I was gonna bring up, or like, what are kind of your biggest concerns of your what you're doing and your female character and the feedback there. But that's my biggest concern still is like, there's no love storyline here. And it's like, my female character is there, and I'm hoping she's doing and making her own decisions that impact her storyline and then the overall plot. And I don't need her and the main character to, like, they become friends. There's a huge trust issue throughout it, and I think you have to start there. But in my mind, there was never a moment of me being like, you know what? In Act 3, they're gonna finally get over this little hurdle and make out, and I gotta write this whole thing. I was like, it's not happening. They're working through this problem on a timeline and need to do it together. And that's just people working together. So hopefully that comes through. But
Russ, when it's come to character descriptions, right? So you said like one of your leads is a female. So did you have any hesitation about describing their looks or their actions? And were you like, scared of objectifying this character in a way that felt, that would land flat?
Yes. And because I would say that my female character, because I already had an idea of her backstory, and she's hopefully, if I can keep doing this thing, she'll end up in her own series. And so I already had her backstory fleshed out, and I already kind of saw her as a character more so than my protagonist in this one. This one was just kind of like a stick figure, and he's just like kind of there, and I finally got breathed some life into him. But yeah, I think originally I was worried because I was like, wow, I'm describing her, and I wouldn't say physical features so much as like just kind of hair and like basic stuff, right? But I got like, what's the line? What's the line of like, am I describing too much, and is it important to know? And it's like, no, but there's some key things of like, she's got a tattoo on her arm that's like a representation of her past, and it's like, okay, I need to describe that. I need to have someone recognize that, even if it's just an offhand thing, but someone needs to spot that because it is important for her character and where she's come. So yeah, I definitely worried, but
that's why I feel like in a lot of the
I've avoided
a lot of the comps that I read, right? Like I think what you're describing, it sounds to me like an equity of description. You're not treating her any different than you're treating a different character.
Yeah.
Whereas like on some of the older comps like Kuntz, which once again, killer writer, great descriptions, but there's not an equity in description.
I want to take a step back and kind of get more into kind of like your story. And did you have a particular reason for choosing a female character as your lead and protagonist? Because you said you have multiple characters obviously going on that kind of reflect this really heavy tension during the time. Mm-hmm. And are all your characters teenagers, or are they?
They're not all teenagers. They kind of go from teen years up until like early 30s for my characters.
But your main female character, why did you decide to choose her as like kind of your POV, your primary? And
it's a good question, and maybe a psychological question. I'm not quite sure. Obviously I came up watching horror. Yeah. I always personally identify with the final girl. I always liked the final girl. Yeah. I read this really great book when I was younger, in college. It was called, Men, Women, and Chainsaws by Carol Clover. And she takes this really nice feminist perspective looking at the slasher films of the 80s. And she argues that the audience isn't solely identifying with the slasher as this kind of misogynistic force, but they're also identifying with the final girl. I think that's completely correct. I think there is some empowerment to be had in that character. So I think that's probably where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
Even though like my character isn't necessarily a final girl per se, this isn't a slasher story, but I think that's probably the impetus for me landing on a female lead. And it just felt right for me. It being a suburban boy felt very boring and not fun to write for me. And honestly, maybe a little too autobiographical for my own. Granted, we're all pieces of every character we write, but I didn't want this to be, my look back at my teen years. I also didn't want this to be me writing a cool girlfriend for myself either, right? Like I didn't want this to be a character who knows everything, who's like just absolutely perfect at everything they do. I wanted there to be a struggle and growth through it. So it just felt right. I don't know if that's a great answer, but it just felt like the right character.
No, that is a great answer, because if it feels right for the story and the character, I mean, that's where you start, right? So what's been your approach for like writing your female character?
Well, first you have to treat them like people.
Step one.
Really, I do think
don't be an asshole.
I think that's, it's silly. Like one of the hesitations about even doing this podcast, right? Just like writing about a female character. It's like two white dudes with beards, one of them who's in a basement right now recording, talking about how to write a female character. But, there's a hesitation there that, you're going to be grilled by even talking about these things. But I think it's a super valid conversation.
You look through the kind of like the course of your film and book history here, you've got some of your good, female leads, you've got your Ripley and Sarah Connor, who might be a little too badass, maybe some might explain, or maybe, but I think there's, Sarah Connor's got like this kind of growth you see from the first movie, the second movie, right? Which kind of makes sense.
It's great, but they both end up in really skimpy clothes.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is really aimed at the male segment of the audience there.
Right.
Like there's empowerment, but there's still that kind of
100%.
Male gaze,
which
right?
is kind of like, man.
And speaking of male gaze, it's weird. So you don't want to write your characters as if you're objectifying them and just talking about their physical characteristics in a sexual way.
Yeah.
But to talk about female characters, especially during this time period, they could be, I certainly have one scene in particular where my lead is, objectified by a really kind of sleazy, crummy character.
Yeah.
And that was a tricky scene to write because I want to get across that this character is a jerk and disgusting and sleazy and kind of oppressive. But I didn't want to use that character as an avatar for the audience to get a little T and A in, right?
Yeah.
Like how am I going to like, so obviously he's leering at this character. How do I make it so I'm not leering at this character? And I think I did an okay job, like not, once again, like I described him more than her, right?
Yep.
And didn't like, I wanted her to feel gross for a second so she can like, grow through that grossness. And like, I think it landed okay, but I was really hesitant in doing that because all of a sudden, I was for a moment that sleazy character and like, what's he seeing? And then there's that question, well, what do you describe here? Are you going to describe this? And it felt, I was actually uncomfortable writing it. But yeah, I ended up landing on, once again, like I said before, not landing on her and really what he's seeing, but more on his actions and what he's doing, the noises he's making, where his eyes fall and not so much, how her legs look in her pants,
right?
How her jacket falls on her chest or whatever. Like, and that's a very, very deliberate conversation or very, very deliberate decision.
Yeah.
And, obviously if I'd written some kind of, I don't know, scintillating piece about how she looked, there's certainly a segment of the audience who would read this book that would enjoy that, but that's not the story I'm telling. And I didn't want to dive into it.
Yeah.
It was there, it was like on the platter. It was like, here you go. Here's like a little seedy, sultry bit that people can read on the beach. And it was like, no, not for my character. I just didn't want to do it.
Yeah. Cause then it might be a sense of like kind of lessening that character, that
I think so.
Right?
It's like, there's like, I wanted her to feel objectified. I did not want to objectify her.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. Like I said, there's a genre thing and there's genre expectation. Obviously for folks who write romance.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
And there's a ton of self-published folks who are writing romance and they're very successful at it. But I think there's an equity. I think they're treating all of their characters similar. Yeah. So if you're describing everybody's bodies, go for it. That's your genre. That's what it is. And you're given the same description for the men and the women and the transgender folks that you're giving everything, right? So
yeah. Have you so I'm kind of like now coming back to someone put it out to me the other day, a friend of mine were talking about the book, and she actually asked me, she's like, oh, so what's like your character's motivation or whatever, and before I could get like talking about it, she was like, I'll just tell you right now, it seems like the latest motivation for all females and like all new TV shows and movies is the old dead mom trope. And I was like, okay, well, her motivation is her entire family's dead. Is that where? It's like, oh no. But she's like, that's what I see in like all new TV shows these days. The kind of the dead mom thing. And I was like, that's interesting because that's, a flip, like, obviously male characters have the dead father thing. And, which of course I've touched on in my story. But
I think that speaks, Russ, to the importance of maybe writing in a bubble, but like what you're doing, edit with feedback. So getting, females to beta read and give you feedback, I think is just such a smart idea, and your characters will be better for it. That's a great advice from her.
Yeah. And I think I've learned quite a bit from kind of vetting female characters and from my beta group, any female readers, I've just been like, hey, can you pay attention to this character? Does this seem too much? And one reader was like, she seems a bit of like a Mary Sue, like she's kind of too powerful. And I was like, that's a good point. Maybe there's something I can do here to like, she has to lose somewhere. She can't be the only one kind of like winning the day. Like she also has to have the same pitfalls as like all the other characters, right? She can't just come in and be like, I can do it all type of thing. But the dead mom is like kind of like a new, I guess, trope coming around. That's
interesting.
That kind of floats around, which I haven't noticed, but now I'm going to start kind of paying attention to it.
Yeah, I will say that my main character, her motivation is not a dead mom. I don't know how long her mom survives, but
that's no spoilers. No spoilers
there. Yeah.
No spoilers.
So Russ, do you have any like tips or advice, that you found helpful while writing your female characters?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Again, I'm kind of still a very new author here, writer. So, but things I've kind of gleaned from just paying attention to other books I've read in media and movies, and just kind of watching analysis videos, which I watched a great one the other day about the Born Yesterday female character, which I thought was kind of interesting. I was drowned in movies since like the 50s and 60s. I was like, oh, this is terrible character trope. But I think, some things like that I'm just trying to, that I think are important, that I think are again, my opinion, but
Fifth Element's an example of that, right?
Oh yeah. Fifth Element's a big one. Yeah. The Born Yesterday, the Tron Legacy. That's another one.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man. Okay.
Splash. If you want to go back, Splash.
Encino Man, if we're being equitable.
Yeah. If we're being equitable, Encino Man. Blast from the Past, if you want to flip it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of them. If you go further back to like Time Machine and like from like 19, what was that, 60s, 1950s, 50s or something, and then Forbidden Planet. It's just like, oh my God. And Star Trek, classic Star Trek. James T. Kirk had to kiss every female alien he saved. So kind of interesting. And I think just paying attention to those tropes that are floating around is kind of like, this isn't, it's not, they're not on the same page. But I think one, paying attention to that stuff, you know, obviously having female characters have experience, like have them have experiences in the world, you know, don't make them this innocent character. Mm-hmm. Agency was kind of like the number one thing for me, was just making sure that, like, you know, the idea that the power people have to think for themselves and like act in ways that, you know, shape their experience and life trajectories, and like making sure like my character, that every character should have that, you know, and don't just skip on that just because it's a secondary character or, you know, tertiary character. They just may have a smaller part, but they should have their own ability to think and do the things in this world, right? And then the key thing for me was also making sure she has her own interaction with the plot. Like, she's got her own storyline, she's got her own shit to deal with, and it just so happens that hers interacts with, you know, this other storyline with my main lead there. Everyone should be interacting with the plot in their own way to kind of move the story forward. For me, those things, kind of keeping those in mind, have kind of somewhat helped, but I still run into the trap of like, maybe I'm trying to overcompensate by making her too strong, too powerful of a character that she can do anything, where I should still give her the same downfalls as like my male characters and whatnot. But those are kind of the things I've been.
Yeah. I mean,
generally keeping
I'm familiar with that character, and I think that's okay. I mean, she has like a really unique skill set from your other characters, so I don't think she comes across as a Mary Sue, but it's a good question.
Something maybe in the editing process, I'll you know, talk to someone who doesn't know me and who maybe has.
What about other secondary characters? Because right now, as I'm thinking, you know, I have three other female characters that don't quite get the spotlight as much, and I'm trying to think. You know, obviously they don't get as much description, and the reader doesn't spend as much time with them. Yeah. But I guess it would still be very important to make sure they have their own complete arcs, that they're not just there to prop up, you know, their male counterparts or something.
Yeah, and I think even if it's not something that's written in the world, but it's there, you know, and you can allude to it here and there. I mean, every character should have their own arc, you know, even if it's something small versus.
Yeah, maybe to a fault. I think all of my female characters are significantly stronger than the men they're with or around. Yeah, that's probably something I have to take a look at. But I really want to critique men.
I mean, I think that's completely fine. Yeah. You know, I've got a secondary female character, and she's got her own backstory. She's got her own kind of existence in the world and her own, you know, kind of arc in a way. But her biggest thing is I gave her, like, she's kind of like a great setup payoff for later, where she provides something for everyone else to be like, oh, okay. Yeah. So it kind of gives her, you know, this smaller thread of a plot line, but it's there, you know, even though she's a secondary character, she's very important to kind of the overall plot and figuring out what the hell's going on.
I have my secondary characters often dealing with men who are like, have this like testosterone induced need to lead in this like pseudo apocalyptic scenario, which is completely the wrong decision at the time, you know? Yeah. And there's like, I have a conflict there, right? Where like the guys are trudging forward because this is all of a sudden football or whatever. Yeah, yeah. And the female characters who are seeing things a little clearer, or at least aren't being so I don't know, naively driven towards a goal.
Yeah, not so single focused, kind of single vision.
Yeah,
kind of the things I've been just thinking about as I write every character, and you know, I think obviously it plays a part for female characters as well. Is there anything, you know, on your side other than just don't be an asshole?
You know, I guess that's the simplest advice that I keep coming back to, right? I guess.
I mean, it encompasses everything.
Tips. It's just don't be a jerk and be equitable in your descriptions, and make sure you get feedback from your friends and from women who are, you know, honest about your feedback. One bit of advice, and this is something I need to personally take, because it's a huge blind spot. I've told you before, right? I've read a lot of comps. A lot of the comps that deal in genre, very similar types of scenarios, they're written by men. You know, even if they're men writing women, they're still men. And I have not read enough female authors. So what I need to do is, I think I need to break out of maybe not genre, but at least scenario. Yeah. And I need to read more female authors, because I think it will become, I think my inadequacies will become clearer when I see how those characters are treated.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny because I was looking through the last few books I read, probably last, you know, actually the last 3, and I'm currently in the middle of one, have been by female authors.
That's awesome.
They're kind of interesting because I mean, one, so the 5th season, which I'm not, have you heard about that one?
No, I haven't.
N.K. Jemisin. It's really good. I have my own critiques about it, but it's overall, I really enjoyed it. And it's kind of like more like a fantasy, won a Hugo Awards. It's definitely worth putting on the list, especially from its narrative structure. I think is pretty great. And then there's like the 2 I'm reading, or one I'm reading right now. I'm halfway through. It's like a FBI kind of procedural serial killer hunt where the main character is a female FBI agent
By a woman.
Yeah, Isabella Maldonado. It's good. I'm enjoying it. It's interesting though. And then the other book I had read was Her Name Is Night by Yasmin Ngo. I think that's how you pronounce her last name. And that one I really enjoyed, but that was violent.
Really?
Yeah, it was about an assassin, and I mean she was so badass. But it's interesting between like the 3 of these, and especially the last 2 I mentioned. It's interesting to see their motivations are from like some really traumatic experience in their past, like some very
Death
very
of a mother.
no. Oh man, no. Her Name Is Night is it's brutal. And it's just like, there's some very tragic thing that occurred in their life. At its core, it's like a revenge story.
Mm-hmm. Did you glean anything from how those female characters are being handled, save for like the traumatic past, like from scene to scene, beat to beat? Any tips you could glean?
The attention to detail and the way the character feels in each moment. I mean, I think a lot of writers obviously capture that pretty well, but I think there's a handling of it, and especially with these 3 authors, especially with the 5th season and Her Name Is Night, where it's kind of an important part where you catch that sensitivity and that emotion side of it, and that's what's kind of fueling some of the bit of the conflict within the scenes outside of what someone's actually done to someone, which I thought was kind of interesting.
What about the handling of male characters? Did you notice, like, did it stick out to you at all as a male character, or just, flew over flawlessly? They weren't like, his butt looks so great in these, Levi's jeans.
No, definitely none
Shocking,
of that.
right? And amazing how that.
Yeah. I mean, I would say if anything, like, I don't think it's a dig or anything like that, but I think it's some of the male characters were, I don't want to say one note, but they weren't as.
I mean, if we're being honest, Russ, we're very one note.
No, I mean, but we are. So
I don't think that's a critique. That's probably
not
a
wrong.
fair representation.
Yeah. So I mean, I know. I mean, it was interesting perspective, I guess. Cool. But I honestly, I think all 3 of them are great reads. And I'm reading the last one, The Cipher, mostly because it's like an FBI kind of crime procedural thing, which I'm kind of planning to do for coming up. And I just wanted to see how it was character. But the most interesting to me was just the motivation and the thing that kind of sets them and defines them as characters is kind of like these major events that obviously happen in their past, but that's for every character, right? Like there's got to be some motivation or something that's happened to you. So it's just coming back to the idea of like every character should have their own experience, whether it's male or female. If you're writing, a female lead, make sure they have something that's, doesn't have to be dark, but
right.
Everyone needs some motivation. So yeah, I think that's our episode. It was a good chat.
Yeah, that was, I mean, if I'm being honest, uncomfortable, I guess, because I don't feel like I can speak about a woman's experience with any kind of authority, which is why I'm blessed to have female beta readers and would really love and need to read more female horror authors. Yeah. So if honestly, if anybody who's listening has any recommendations, it doesn't need to be apocalyptic. It can be anything. Just at me. You can hit us on Twitter at writer_syndrome. Or you can go to our website, writersyndrome.com, where you can find each of our individual Twitter accounts if you want to follow us, add us, whatever. You can also, if you have a topic idea or if you want to just send us an email, you can do that way too. chat@writersyndrome.com. And if you're angry and frustrated about this episode, I apologize. We did our best. We're doing our best. We're trying to do better. That's all you can do is do better. That's probably the best damn thing we could say. Don't be an asshole and do better, right? Yeah, don't be an asshole. Do better. So thanks. Definitely read more. Thanks everyone for listening. But you should join us next time where we're going to discuss pantsers versus planners. I know what side you fall on. Yep, we are on complete flip sides. So yeah, that'll be our topic for next episode. So I'm starting to come around, but we can discuss it next week. Yeah, I'll convert you sooner or later with one of my spreadsheets. So many fucking spreadsheets, dude. Spreadsheets that can rule the world.
So that'll be our topic for next episode. So if you join us until then, keep fighting.